The final footage showed Commander Chen standing alone on the bridge of the Indomitable. The ship's hull was mostly gone, and she was wearing a vacuum suit. Through the holes in the ship, she could see stars and the burning wreckage of the battle. "All civilian transports have jumped to hyperspace," came the announcement over the communication channel. "Evacuation complete. All personnel are clear." Commander Chen looked around her ruined bridge. Only 6 crew members had chosen to stay with her. They were scattered throughout the ship, keeping critical systems running for just a few more minutes. "This is Chen to all remaining crew," she said calmly. "We did it. 40,000 people are safe because of what we did here today." Her voice was tired but proud. "I want you to know that your families will be told how you died. They will know that you chose to stand when others could not. They will know that humans do not abandon the innocent." The reactor warning alarms were getting louder. The ship had perhaps 1 minute left before the nuclear explosion. "It has been an honor serving with all of you," Chen said. "See you on the other side." The display went white as the Indomitable's reactor exploded. When the light faded, there was nothing left but debris and radiation. The classroom was silent for a long time. Professor Cathalvex waited for the cadets to process what they had seen. Finally, Zexhai spoke. His crystalline voice was barely a whisper. "How many survived?" "From the human crews?" Professor Cathalvex asked. 237 people made it to the escape pods. Out of 8,600 humans who participated in the battle, she let the numbers sink in. "That is a casualty rate of 97.3%, she continued. "In any other military force, that would be considered a complete disaster. But the mission was successful. Every civilian was evacuated safely." Velnara raised her hand shakily. "What happened to the swarm fleet?" "Completely destroyed," the professor replied. "The human tactics confused their adaptation protocols. The swarm could not develop countermeasures against an enemy that became more dangerous as their situation became more hopeless." She brought up a new display showing the final battle statistics. The numbers were staggering. 15 human ships against 200 swarm vessels, she read. Final result: 0 human ships survived, but 0 swarm ships escaped. The enemy fleet was 100% eliminated. Kreetak's implants were flashing in distress. That is impossible. How can a force that is completely destroyed also achieve total victory? Because humans do not measure victory the same way other species do, Professor Cathalvex explained. Most species fight to win battles. Humans fight to end wars. She brought up more classified files. During the 3-year Void Swarm War, human forces achieved an 847% casualty exchange ratio against the enemy. For every human who died, more than 8 swarm units were destroyed. The cadets stared at the numbers in shock. Every major swarm defeat during the war coincided with significant human involvement. The professor continued. The enemy could adapt to any logical military strategy, but they could not adapt to human emotional responses. She showed them footage from other battles. Human ships ramming enemy vessels. Human boarding parties fighting inside swarm bioships with knives and hand tools. Human engineers staying at their posts as their ships were dissolved by bioacids. The swarm's greatest strength was their ability to learn from each encounter, Professor Cathalvex explained. But they could not learn to counter an enemy that fought hardest when death was certain. Maria Santos, one of the human cadets, raised her hand. Professor, if humans were so effective against the swarm, why were they banned from combat after the war? Professor Cathalvex looked at the young woman with sad eyes. Because the galaxy learned something that day. We discovered that humans do not fight wars to win them. They fight wars to end them. And there is a difference. She brought up post-battle interviews with human survivors. The cadets watched as traumatized men and women spoke about their experiences. We lost so many good people, said Lieutenant Martinez, the engineering officer who had survived the Indomitable. I keep thinking about all the things we could have done differently. The interviewer asked him about the tactical success of the mission. Success? Martinez laughed bitterly. 8,000 of my friends are dead. How is that success? But you saved 40,000 civilians, the interviewer pointed out. Martinez was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I suppose that is what we were there for, but it does not make it hurt less. The cadets watched similar interviews with other human survivors. None of them celebrated their victory. None of them talked about their tactical achievements. They only spoke about their regret at not being able to save their fallen comrades. This is what the Council found disturbing, Professor Kthalvex explained. Humans achieved the greatest military victory in galactic history, and their response was to grieve for their losses. Zexai raised his hand. I do not understand. Should they not be proud of their achievement? That is exactly the point, the professor replied. Most species would be proud. They would study the battle and try to replicate the tactics. They would see the human approach as the key to military success. She paused and looked around the room, but the Council realized that human military effectiveness comes from something that cannot be taught or replicated. It comes from a willingness to die for strangers. It comes from treating the preservation of other lives as more important than your own survival. The display showed new footage, post-war analysis, conducted by the galaxy's best military minds. The Nexari High Command spent 2 years trying to develop training programs that would teach other species to fight like humans, Professor Kthalvex said. They failed completely. Why? Asked a Corvani cadet. Because you cannot train someone to value other lives more than their own, the professor explained. That is not a tactical skill. It is a fundamental characteristic of human psychology. She brought up more classified documents. The Council's final report concluded that human involvement in warfare was too dangerous to continue, she read. Not dangerous to the enemy, but dangerous to the other species in the Galactic Defense Force. The cadets looked confused. Other species that fought alongside humans began adopting human tactics, the professor explained. Zephyrian crews started ramming enemy ships. Corvani soldiers began staying at hopeless positions instead of retreating. Naxari commanders started ordering suicidal attacks. The implications were disturbing. The human approach to warfare was spreading to other species, Professor Kthalvex continued, and those species were not psychologically equipped to handle the emotional cost. Depression rates among non-human veterans increased by 300% during the war. She showed them medical reports and psychological evaluations. Many alien veterans developed what human doctors call survivors. Guilt, she explained. They could not understand why they lived when their human comrades died. Some of them refused to leave military service, hoping to die in the next battle. The classroom was silent as the cadets absorbed this information, so the Council made a decision, Professor Kthalvex said. They banned humans from combat roles not to protect the galaxy from human inadequacy, but to protect the galaxy from human influence. She closed the classified files and looked around the room. The Council decided that some victories cost too much, not in ships or resources, but in what we become when we learn to fight like humans do. Zexai raised his hand again. Professor, if human tactics are so effective, should we not want to learn from them? Professor Kthalvex was quiet for a long time before answering. That, cadet, is the question that keeps Council members awake at night, she said finally. The galaxy is safer with humans in support roles. But if another existential threat like the Void Swarm appears, we may not have a choice. She looked at the human cadets sitting in the back of the room. The humans are still here, still willing to serve. The question is whether the galaxy is ready to pay the price of their protection. The lecture ended in complete silence. As the cadets filed out of the classroom, none of them looked at the human students. They walked past them like they were seeing ghosts, because now they understood the truth. Humans were not banned from combat because they were weak. They were banned because they were too strong. And that strength came from a place too dark for other species to follow. Professor Kthalvex advanced the footage to show the second wave of the swarm attack. The cadets watched as more biomechanical ships moved toward the remaining human vessels. Only 11 ships from the original 15 were still fighting. The swarm had learned from the first attack, the professor explained. They adapted their weapons to counter standard Galactic Defense Force tactics. Against any other species, the battle would have been over. On the display, the swarm ships fired new types of weapons, bioacids that could eat through ship hulls and neural disruptors that could shut down computer systems. These weapons had been developed by analyzing the debris from previous battles. But watch what happens, Professor Kthalvex said. The human ships responded in ways that made no tactical sense. Instead of falling back to analyze the new weapons, they charged forward. When their computer systems failed, the crew switched to manual controls. When their hulls began dissolving, they rerouted power to keep fighting. Sci-Fi watched in fascination as a human gunner continued firing his weapons even after bioacid had eaten through the gun deck's outer hull. The man was wearing an emergency suit and working in vacuum, but he never stopped shooting. "This is not logical behavior," Sci-Fi said out loud. "No," Professor Cathalvex agreed. "It is not logical. That is exactly why it worked." The display zoomed in on another human ship, the destroyer Thermopylae's Gate. Its captain was a woman named Rebecca Torres. Her ship had lost main power and was drifting, but the crew was still fighting, engineering. "I need whatever power you can give me," Captain Torres said over the ship's communication system. "Captain, the reactor is offline," came the reply. "We are running on emergency batteries only." "Then give me the batteries," Torres said calmly. "All of them." "Ma'am, if we dump all battery power into the weapons, we will lose life support. The ship will be dead in space." Captain Torres was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. "Transport Group 12 is still loading passengers. We need to buy them more time." The engineering officer's voice was steady when he replied, "Understood, Captain. Transferring all power to weapons now." The cadets watched as the human destroyer's weapons came back online for one final barrage. The ship fired everything it had at the nearest swarm vessel, destroying it completely. Then all the lights went out, and the Thermopylae's Gate went dark and silent. 43 crew members died on that ship, Professor Cathalvex said quietly. They could have used the battery power to keep life support running for 6 more hours. Rescue ships might have reached them. "Why did they not wait for rescue?" asked a Corvani cadet. "Because Transport Group 12 needed those 6 minutes more than they needed 6 hours, the professor replied. The footage continued. Hour after hour, the human ships kept fighting in ways that defied military logic. When they ran out of ammunition, they rammed enemy vessels. When their weapons failed, they used their ships as shields to protect the station. "Look at the civilian evacuation progress." Professor Cathalvex pointed to a chart on the side of the display. Each time a human ship sacrificed itself, another group of transports reached safety. The pattern was clear. Every human sacrifice had a purpose: to buy time, to create an opening, to protect something or someone else. David Park, the human medical student, raised his hand. "Professor, where were the other Galactic Defense Force ships? Why did only 15 ships respond to defend the station?" Professor Cathalvex nodded approvingly. "An excellent question. The answer is that this was considered a hopeless battle. High Command had already written off Thermopylae Station. They ordered the nearest fleet groups to fall back and establish a defensive line 3 systems away." "But the humans disobeyed orders?" Velnara asked. "No," the professor said. "The human crews were volunteers. When the evacuation order came, Commander Chen asked for volunteers to stay behind and buy time for the civilian transports. Every single human in the fleet volunteered immediately. The display showed the fleet roster again. Name after name scrolled past. Humans from Earth and its colonies, all of them volunteers. The non-human crew members were given the option to transfer to evacuation ships. Professor Cathalvex continued. Some chose to stay and fight alongside the humans. Others chose to leave. Both choices were considered honorable. Sci-Fi found himself studying the faces of the human crew members on the display. They looked scared but determined. None of them seemed angry or excited about the fighting. They just looked sad. "They do not look like warriors," he said. "No," Professor Cathalvex agreed. "They look like people who wish they did not have to fight. But they fight anyway because someone has to." The footage advanced to hour 12 of the battle. Only 7 human ships were still functional. The swarm had lost over 50 vessels, but they still outnumbered the defenders by more than 20 to 1. "This is when the swarm made their mistake," Professor Cathalvex said. On the display, the swarm ships began a new attack pattern. Instead of trying to destroy the human vessels, they started boarding them. Biomechanical creatures flowed out of the swarm ships like a living tide. The swarm had analyzed human tactics and concluded that humans were more effective when they could sacrifice their ships, the professor explained. So they decided to capture the ships intact and use them against the station. The cadets watched as the alien creatures swarmed through the hulls of the human vessels. The boarding action should have ended the battle quickly. Any logical species would surrender when faced with being overwhelmed in close combat. But humans do not surrender, Professor Cathalvex said. The footage switched to internal cameras on the human ships. The cadets saw narrow corridors filled with smoke and flashing emergency lights. Human crew members fought the boarding creatures with whatever weapons they could. Find what they saw next made several cadets gasp in shock. Human engineer named Thomas Kim was trapped in a corridor, with 3 swarm creatures advancing on him. His weapon was damaged and he was bleeding from multiple wounds. Any rational being would try to escape or surrender. Instead, Thomas Kim smiled and held up a small device. "See you in hell," he said, and pressed the button. The explosion destroyed that entire section of the ship, killing Kim and all 3 swarm creatures instantly. Self-destruct charges, Professor Kthalvex explained. The human crews had placed them throughout their ships before the battle began. If the swarm boarded them, they would deny the enemy any useful captures. The footage showed similar scenes throughout the fleet. Human crew members fighting to the last moment, then triggering explosions rather than letting their ships be captured. This made no sense to the swarm, the professor said. Their biomechanical brains could not process the concept of choosing death over capture. They had never encountered a species that would destroy valuable assets, rather than lose them to the enemy. Kretox implants were flashing rapidly, but the tactical value of preserving the ships was less important to the humans than preventing the swarm from using those ships against the civilians, Professor Kthalvex interrupted. Humans calculate military value differently than other species. The display showed the aftermath of the boarding actions. Every single human ship that was boarded had been destroyed by its own crew. The swarm had gained nothing from their new tactics. Hour 15, the professor announced. 3 human ships remaining. The last civilian transport groups were still loading passengers. The final 3 ships, the heavy cruiser Indomitable, the destroyer Marathon, and the corvette David and Goliath, were barely functional. They had no shields, limited weapons, and holes in their hulls. At this point, any other species would have retreated, Professor Kthalvex said. The tactical situation was hopeless. But watch what Commander Chen does. On the display, Commander Chen opened a communication channel to all remaining ships. "All ships, this is Chen. We have bought the time we needed. The last transports are loading now. Our job is almost finished." She paused, looking around her damaged bridge. "I want you all to know that it has been an honor serving with you. Your families will remember that you chose to stand when others could not. Your species will remember that humans do not abandon the innocent." The crew members on all 3 ships straightened up despite their injuries and exhaustion. "Now let us finish this job," Commander Chen said quietly. The 3 human ships began their final attack run against the swarm fleet. The holographic display showed a massive space station floating in the darkness of space. Thermopylae Station was huge, easily 10 times larger than Kepler Academy. It had multiple docking rings, residential sections, and industrial areas. Thousands of lights twinkled across its surface. Thermopylae Station was a critical supply depot, Professor Kthalvex explained, as the image rotated slowly. It served the entire Outer Rim sector. 40,000 civilians lived and worked there. The timestamp in the corner of the display read 15 years ago. The cadets watched in fascination as cargo ships moved in and out of the station's docking bays. This was during the Void Swarm War, the professor continued. The enemy had already destroyed 12 inhabited systems. Billions of people were dead or missing. Sexhai shifted in his seat. He had studied the Void Swarm War in basic history classes. The swarm was described as the most dangerous enemy the galaxy had ever faced. They were biomechanical creatures that could adapt to any weapon used against them. The swarm fleet arrived at Thermopylae on a Tuesday morning, Professor Kthalvex said. 200 enemy vessels dropped out of hyperspace and surrounded the station. The display changed to show the arrival of the swarm fleet. The ships were organic-looking, like massive insects with metal parts grafted onto their bodies. They moved in strange, flowing patterns that made no logical sense. Several cadets made sounds of disgust. The Nexari cadet Kretox implants flickered nervously. "I have never seen ships like those," he whispered. The Galactic Defense Force had 15 ships in the area, Professor Kthalvex continued. They were outnumbered more than 10 to 1. Standard protocol called for immediate retreat to preserve military assets. A new image appeared, the small defense fleet positioned between the swarm and the station. The ships looked tiny compared to the enemy force surrounding them, but the defense fleet did not retreat, the professor said. "Do you know why?" Belnara raised her crystalline hand. "Because they had orders to protect the civilians?" "No," Professor Kthalvex said. "The evacuation order had already been given. The civilians were being loaded onto transport ships. The defense fleet could have withdrawn and escorted the transports to safety. The room was quiet. The cadets did not understand. The defense fleet stayed because they knew something the rest of us did not. The professor explained. They knew the swarm would catch the slow-moving civilian transports before they reached hyperspace. So they made a different choice. The display zoomed in on the flagship of the defense fleet, a heavy cruiser called the Indomitable. The camera focused on the bridge where a human woman in a commander's uniform was giving orders. "This is Commander Sarah Chen," Professor Thalvek said. Age 34. Wife and mother of 2 children. She had been in the Galactic Defense Force for 12 years. Commander Chen looked calm as she spoke to her crew. Her voice came through the speakers clearly. "All ships, this is Indomitable Actual. We cannot win this fight using standard tactics. The swarm adapts too quickly to conventional warfare. But we can buy time for the civilian evacuation if we are willing to pay the price." The human commander paused and looked around her bridge. "I want every crew member to understand what we are about to do. We are going to hold this position until every civilian transport reaches hyperspace. We will not retreat. We will not surrender. Some of us may not see home again." Zexhai felt something cold in his crystalline core. The way Commander Chen spoke was different from any military briefing he had heard in his classes. "Now I need to tell you something that was not in your history books," Professor Thalvek said to the cadets. "Something that was classified until very recently." She pressed another button and a crew roster appeared on the display. The names and species of every person serving in the defense fleet scrolled past. 78% of the personnel in that defense fleet were human, the professor said quietly. The classroom erupted in shocked whispers. Zexhai stared at the numbers on the display. This could not be right. Humans were banned from combat roles. They always had been. "But that is impossible," Velnara said out loud. "Humans have never been allowed in frontline combat positions." "You are thinking of the current regulations," Professor Cathalvex replied. "The ban was implemented after the Void Swarm War ended. Before that, humans served in combat roles throughout the Galactic Defense Force." Lisa Chen, the human engineering student, sat up straighter in her seat. She looked at her 2 human classmates with wide eyes. "My grandfather," she whispered. "He really was there." Professor Cathalvex heard her and nodded. "Many human families lost members in this war. The casualty rates among human personnel were—" She paused. "We will get to that." The display returned to showing the swarm fleet as it began its attack on Thermopylae Station. The biomechanical ships moved forward in waves, firing weapons that looked like streams of living acid. "The battle lasted 18 hours, Professor Cathalvex said. "What you are about to see is why the Council banned humans from combat after the war ended. The first wave of swarm ships reached the defense fleet. The human-led vessels opened fire with everything they had. Laser beams and missile trails lit up the space around the station. Standard defensive formation, Zexhai observed. Nothing unusual so far. But as the battle continued, the cadets began to notice something strange. When swarm weapons damaged the human ships, the crews did not retreat for repairs. Instead, they kept fighting even as their vessels began falling apart around them. On the display, they could see inside one of the human ships. The bridge was filled with smoke and sparks flew from damaged consoles. Several crew members were injured, but they remained at their stations. "Reactor at 60%, a human engineer reported over the ship's communication system. "Hull breaches on deck 7 through 12. Life support failing in sections C and D. "Keep us in the fight," Commander Chen's voice responded. "Civilian Transport Group 3 is still loading passengers." The engineering officer nodded and turned back to his controls. Even though blood was running down his face from a head injury, Kretox implants were flashing rapidly. "This is not standard procedure," he said. "They should evacuate the damaged sections and fall back for repairs." "Humans do not fall back," Professor Cathalvex said simply. The battle footage continued. The cadets watched as human ships continued fighting long after other species would have retreated. When their weapons were damaged, the crews repaired them under fire. When their shields failed, they used their ships as physical barriers to protect the station. "Look at the swarm's response." Professor Cathalvex pointed to the enemy ships on the display. "They are trying to adapt to human tactics, but they cannot." The biomechanical vessels were clearly confused. Their usual strategy was to learn from each attack and develop countermeasures. But the human ships kept changing their tactics in ways that made no logical sense. Humans do not fight like other species, the professor explained. Most species use logic and probability calculations to determine their battle strategies. Humans use something else. What? Zexai asked despite himself. Emotion, Professor Cathalvex said. Specifically, the emotional need to protect others, even at the cost of their own lives. The display showed Commander Chen's ship as it moved directly into the path of a massive swarm vessel. The enemy ship was 3 times larger and heavily armed. What is she doing? Velnara gasped. That is suicide. She is buying time, Professor Cathalvex said. Transport Group 7 just finished loading and needs 30 more seconds to reach minimum safe distance for hyperspace jump. Commander, Chen's ship fired everything it had at the swarm vessel while flying directly toward it. The enemy ship tried to adapt its defenses, but it could not process the fact that the human ship was intentionally sacrificing itself. The collision lit up the entire display. Both ships were destroyed instantly. Transport Group 7 jumped to hyperspace successfully, Professor Catalvex announced quietly. The classroom was completely silent. Even the usual background hum of the station system seemed muted. This was just the first hour of the battle, the professor said. There are 17 more hours of footage. She looked around the room at the shocked faces of her students. Now you begin to understand why humans were banned from combat roles. The 3 remaining human ships moved toward the center of the swarm fleet like arrows shot from a bow. Their hulls were cracked in bleeding atmosphere. Their weapons were damaged and their crews were exhausted. But they did not slow down. This is tactically insane, Zexai whispered, his crystalline form dimming with stress. They are outnumbered 60-1. Professor Cathalvex heard him. Yes, it is insane. That is why it worked. On the display, Commander Chen's ship Indomitable led the attack. The heavy cruiser's main guns were firing continuously, even though several of the weapon batteries were visibly damaged and sparking. Weapons control. I need everything you have, Chen's voice came through the speakers. Captain, gun battery 3 is overheating. If we keep firing at this rate, it will explode. Then let it explode, Chen said calmly. But keep firing until it does. The cadets watched as the weapon battery glowed brighter and brighter. Steam and sparks poured from the damaged system. The human gunners stayed at their posts even as the temperature in their section rose to dangerous levels. The gun battery exploded in a brilliant flash. 3 human crew members died instantly. The others in that section kept working at their stations, even though they were now breathing toxic fumes from the damaged systems. They should evacuate that section, Velnara said, her crystalline voice shaking. They cannot, Professor Cathalvex replied. If they leave their posts, the other weapon systems will fail too. So they stay. The destroyer Marathon was in even worse condition. Its captain, James Liu, was steering the ship manually because the computer navigation system had been destroyed. He was using a physical control stick like pilots used thousands of years ago. Engineering, I need more speed, Captain Liu called out. Sir, the engines are already at 110%. If we push them harder, they will blow. How long until they blow? Liu asked. Maybe 5 minutes at this power level. Liu looked at his tactical display. The civilian transports were almost ready to jump to hyperspace. They needed 3 more minutes. Give me 8 minutes, he said. Sir, the engines cannot. Give me 8 minutes, Liu repeated. I do not care what happens after that. The engineering officer's voice was quiet when he replied. Understood, Captain. You will have 8 minutes. The Marathon's engines began glowing white-hot as they were pushed far beyond their design limits. The ship accelerated directly toward the largest swarm vessel in the enemy fleet. The third ship, the corvette David and Goliath, was the smallest vessel in the human fleet. Its captain was a young woman named Sarah Kim, the sister of the engineer who had died earlier in the battle. This is David and Goliath, she announced over the fleet communication channel. I am beginning my attack run. The corvette was so damaged that it was basically flying debris held together by emergency force fields. It had no shields, 1 working gun, and a hull that was more whole than metal. Sarah, fall back. Commander Chen's voice came through the speakers. Your ship cannot survive another hit. I know, Sarah Kim replied. That is the point. The corvette accelerated toward a cluster of swarm ships that were positioned to intercept the civilian transports. Its single working gun fired continuously as it approached. The cadets watching the footage could see that the small ship could not possibly win this fight. The swarm vessels it was attacking were each 10 times larger and heavily armed. "What is she trying to accomplish?" asked Kretuk. "Watch the civilian transports," Professor Ktalvek said, pointing to another part of the display. The transports were moving away from the station as quickly as their massive hulls would allow. But the swarm ships that Sarah Kim was attacking were perfectly positioned to intercept them before they could reach hyperspace. "She is creating a distraction," the professor explained. "The swarm ships have to deal with her attack before they can chase the transports." The corvette David and Goliath reached the swarm cluster and opened fire with its single gun. The weapon was far too small to seriously damage the enemy ships, but it got their attention. All 5 swarm vessels turned to focus on the tiny human ship. Their bioweapons struck the corvette from multiple directions. "Hull breach on all decks," came a report from the corvette's crew. "Life support failing. Main power offline." "How long until the transports are clear?" Sarah Kim asked. 2 minutes, Captain." "Then we hold for 2 minutes," she said simply. The corvette continued its attack run, even as it was being torn apart by enemy fire. Pieces of its hull were flying off in all directions. Atmosphere poured out of dozens of holes. The cadets could see into the ship's bridge through the external cameras. Sarah Kim was still at her captain's chair, even though the entire section was now open to vacuum. She was wearing an emergency suit and manually operating the ship's controls. "Engines are gone," reported her engineering officer over the suit radio. "We are drifting on momentum only. Weapons. The gun is still working, but we have no power to aim it." Sarah Kim looked at her tactical display. The civilian transports were almost clear. 30 more seconds. "All crew abandon ship," she ordered. "Get to the escape pods. And what about you, Captain?" the engineering officer asked. Sarah Kim looked at the swarm ships that were still firing at her vessel. "Someone needs to keep their attention for 30 more seconds." "Captain, that is an order," she said firmly. "Go." The external cameras showed escape pods launching from the dying corvette. But Sarah Kim remained on the bridge, firing the ship's single gun manually and steering with attitude thrusters. The swarm ships kept firing at the corvette, even though it was clearly no longer a threat. They had learned to focus on anything that was shooting at them. 20 seconds. Sarah Kim's ship was now just a collection of debris held together by emergency bulkheads. 10 seconds. The ship's gun finally stopped working, but Sarah Kim kept pointing the wreckage at the swarm vessels, making them think she was still dangerous. 5 seconds. The civilian transports reached minimum safe distance. "Transport Group 14 has jumped to hyperspace," came the announcement over the fleet communication channel. Sarah Kim smiled inside her helmet. Then a swarm bioweapon struck the corvette's bridge directly, and the young captain disappeared in a flash of light. The classroom was completely silent. Several cadets were staring at the display with their mouths open. Transport Group 14 contained 8,000 civilians, Professor Ktalvek said quietly, including 300 children. She advanced the footage to show the final minutes of the battle. Commander Chen's Indomitable was still fighting, but it was barely recognizable as a ship. Most of its hull was gone and the crew was working in vacuum suits. "Captain, this is engineering," came a voice over the communication system. "The reactor is going critical. We need to evacuate immediately." "How long until meltdown?" Chen asked. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Chen looked at her tactical display. The last group of civilian transports was 30 seconds away from jumping to hyperspace. "Can you give me 5 minutes?" she asked. "Captain, if we stay here for 5 minutes, we all die." Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke to her entire crew over the ship's internal communication system. "All hands, this is the captain. The reactor is going critical and we need to evacuate. Anyone who wants to leave should get to the escape pods now. I will not think less of anyone who chooses to live." She paused. "But the last civilian transports are not clear yet. I am staying to make sure they get away safely. Anyone who stays with me, it has been an honor serving with you." The external cameras showed escape pods launching from the Indomitable, but many of the crew members stayed at their posts. "This is Lieutenant Martinez in engineering," came a voice. "I am staying to keep the reactor stable for as long as possible." "This is Gunner Patel," came another voice. "I am staying to keep the weapons firing." One by one, crew members announced their decision to stay. They were not being ordered to remain. They were choosing to die so that strangers could live. "They do not stop," whispered a Nexari cadet. "Even when they know they are going to die, they do not stop." Professor Ktalvex nodded. Now you begin to understand why the Council banned humans from combat roles. The massive space station spun slowly against the starfield. Kepler Station was home to the best military academy in the galaxy. Young beings from dozens of different worlds came here to learn how to fight and protect their civilizations. The main hallway buzzed with activity. Tall, crystal-like Zephyrians walked beside furry Corvani warriors. Sleek Nixari with their glowing implants chatted with other species that humans could barely pronounce the names of. They were all here for the same reason: to become the galaxy's next generation of defenders. Near the combat simulation rooms, a group of Zephyrian cadets gathered around their leader, HFY. His crystalline body caught the light from the overhead panels as he spoke to his friends. "Did you hear about the new ruling from the Council?" HFY asked, his voice carrying the musical tone typical of his species. "They officially banned humans from all combat roles." The other cadets made sounds of amusement. A female Zephyrian named Velnara laughed. "About time. I never understood why they let them try in the first place." Across the hallway, 3 human cadets in engineering uniforms walked past. They kept their eyes down and said nothing. They had heard this conversation many times before. HFY noticed them and raised his voice slightly. "Look at them. They can barely survive in vacuum without those bulky suits. Their reaction times are terrible compared to ours, and they get emotional during combat simulations." A Corvani cadet with thick fur and natural armor plating joined the conversation. "My instructor says humans only joined galactic civilization 50 years ago. We Corvani have been fighting wars for over 3,000 years. "Exactly," HFY said. "They are children playing with weapons they do not understand." The Council was smart to keep them in support roles only. The humans continued walking, but one of them, a young woman with short brown hair, tightened her jaw. Her name was Lisa Chen, and she was studying to be a ship engineer. She wanted to respond to their comments, but she knew it would only make things worse. In the Combat Simulation Center, the daily training was about to begin. The room could create any battle scenario using hard light projections. Today's exercise was a standard fleet engagement, 5 ships against 10 enemy vessels. The instructor, Commander Thekvar of the Nexari, called out team assignments. Team Alpha will be Zephyrian-led. Team Beta will be mixed species. Remember, this simulation is based on actual battle data from the border wars. HFY took command of Team Alpha with confidence. His species was known for quick thinking and tactical brilliance. They could process battle information faster than almost any other species in the galaxy. "Easy victory," he told his teammates as they entered their simulation pods. "The enemy formation is clearly weak on the left flank." The simulation began. Holographic ships appeared around them, and weapon fire lit up the dark space. HFY quickly analyzed the enemy positions and gave orders to his fleet. "Attack pattern Zeta 7, he commanded. "Focus fire on their command vessel." His team moved with precision. Within 15 minutes, they had destroyed 8 of the 10 enemy ships and claimed victory. The other cadets watching from outside the simulation pods applauded. "Excellent work," Commander Thekvar said. "Team Alpha achieved victory with minimal losses. This is exactly the kind of tactical thinking the galaxy needs." HFY stepped out of his pod feeling proud. He looked around the room and noticed the human cadets watching from the back. They were not allowed to participate in combat simulations. "Maybe we should run a special simulation," HFY said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Show everyone what would happen if humans were actually put in combat roles." Some of the other cadets laughed. Commander Thekvar frowned but said nothing. Later that day in the Academy cafeteria, the conversation continued. The large room was filled with cadets from many different species, each group eating food suited to their biology. HFY sat with his usual group at a table near the center of the room. "I looked up human military history," he said. "Before they joined galactic civilization, they fought wars with chemical explosives and metal bullets. Primitive beyond belief." A Nexari cadet named Kretok joined the conversation. "My father served in the border wars. He said human ships were always breaking down. Their technology was unreliable." "That makes sense," Velnara added. "They have no natural advantages. We Zephyrians can think faster. The Corvani are naturally armored. The Nexari can interface directly with ship computers. What can humans do? Nothing useful in combat," HFY concluded. The Council ban was the right decision. At a table near the window, the human cadets ate in silence. There were only 12 humans in the entire academy, all studying engineering, medicine, or logistics. None of them were allowed in the combat tracks. Lisa Chen poked at her food, listening to the conversation across the room. Next to her sat David Park, a medical student, and Maria Santos, who was studying supply chain management. "Do you ever wonder why they really banned us?" Maria asked quietly. David shrugged. "Does it matter? We are here to learn and serve in whatever way we can." "I know," Maria said. "But sometimes I think there is more to the story." Lisa nodded. "My grandfather fought in the Void Swarm War. He never talked about it much, but when he did..." She trailed off. "What?" David asked. "He said things that did not match what they teach us in history class," Lisa said, "about human involvement in the war." Before they could discuss it further, an announcement echoed through the cafeteria. "All cadets report to Xenohistory Classroom 7 for mandatory lecture. Professor Cathalvex will be covering recent galactic conflicts." The cadets began filing out of the cafeteria. Zexhai walked with his group, still joking about human combat abilities. "I bet Professor Thalvex will explain exactly why the council made the right choice," he said to his friends. Professor Thalvex was waiting in the classroom when they arrived. She was an older Corvani with gray fur and deep scars across her armored face. Her 4 eyes watched the cadets file in and take their seats. "Today we will discuss something different," she began once everyone was seated. "I have been listening to conversations around the academy about the human combat ban." Several cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Zexhai sat up straighter. "I hear many of you believe humans were banned from combat roles because they lack ability," Professor Kthalvex continued. "You think they are weak, slow, or primitive?" She walked to the front of the classroom and placed her clawed hand on the control panel for the holographic display system. "You are wrong," she said simply. "And today I'm going to show you why." The room fell silent. Even Zexhai stopped whispering to his neighbors. "What I am about to show you is classified at the highest levels," Professor Cathalvex said. "Very few beings in the galaxy have seen this footage. I am showing it to you because your ignorance about humans could get you killed someday." She entered her security codes into the system. The holographic display flickered to life, showing a timestamp from 15 years ago. "This footage is from Operation Dying Light," she said. "It is the reason I left active combat duty and became a teacher. It is the reason the Council fears human involvement in warfare more than they fear our greatest enemies." The cadets leaned forward in their seats. The joking and laughter from earlier was completely gone. "Prepare yourselves," Professor Cathalvex warned. "What you are about to see will change how you think about humans forever." The display showed a tactical overview of a space station surrounded by enemy ships. The caption read, "Thermopylae Station, Day 1 of Siege." Professor Kthalvex looked around the room one more time. The defense of the station was led by human commanders. The crews were mostly human. "And what they did there," she paused. "What they did there is why your species sleeps safely at night." She pressed the play button and the footage began.